Hello and welcome to the race edition of the Race Weekend Data Analysis for the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, the hectic Grand Prix that was Baku. Now, there is a lot of impressive data to actually look through in today's Grand Prix. We're looking at things like clean air laps, stint pace, and also full teammate breakdowns. So there are going to be timestamps in today's video, so you can skip to whichever section of the video you would like me to talk about. And also, for the interests of time, as the previous episode was just over half an hour long, I've sort of reduced some of the content a little bit to see how you guys actually like it, so I won't be spending as much time on each team as usual. So please let me know in the comments below whether you actually like this change. But without further ado, we will jump on into the race data for the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, and we will start with just the basic positional chart of the race, and it is so much more interesting than the one that we saw in Monaco. There are actually a lot of significant changes, especially in the first pit stop phase of the Grand Prix, and then of course with Vettel's pit stop a couple of laps after the first pit stop phase, and then there were a couple other pit stops around the safety car period, and then of course Hamilton with the red flag incident. Or red flag restart, I should say. Then taking a look at the overall lap chart for the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, we can see those first stages of pit stops over on the left, with the large peak actually coming from Carlos Sainz, who made that mistake into the castle section. That was his slow lap. We then have the late pit stops as well, just before the first safety car, which is between laps 30 and around 36. And then we have the red flag period, or the safety car period leading up to the red flag period, until the end of the Grand Prix. And then just taking a zoomed in look of this section of the lap chart, so we can see in detail who was going quickly and where they were going quickly. We can see some bands of racing, but unfortunately they are not as clear as the Spanish Grand Prix bands of racing. But by these blue arrows here, we can see a nice clearly defined front pack, mid pack, and also a back pack as well. Then post all of the pit stops, we can see that it sort of vaguely splits into roughly 4. You got to be very arbitrary with these sorts of things. You could probably see 3, maybe 4, and if you were really picky, you might just be able to pick out 5. But again, we have the top 3, which is the 2 Red Bulls and Lewis Hamilton. We then have the midfield, then we have the sort of lower midfield, and then we have the back markers as well. And then post safety car period for Lance Stroll's incident, we go back to having 3 bands of racing. We once again have the top field, the midfield, and then a couple of slow runners near the back. But now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at each driver's clean air lap pace over the whole Grand Prix, and then we'll take a look at their clean air lap pace across each of their stints. Now, a clean air lap for the Azerbaijan Grand Prix was determined to be any lap set outside of 2.5 seconds of the car ahead. Now, that does mean for some drivers their percentage of clean air laps over the entire Grand Prix is in the 20 or 30%, whereas some drivers it's just over 50%, but this does enable me to get an accurate representation of their speed and their pace in clean air. However, if your percentage of clean air laps come in the latter half of the Grand Prix versus the early portion of the Grand Prix, there is obviously going to be a pace deficit, hence why I now look at the stint breakdown as well. So on screen now is the Azerbaijan 2021 average competitive clean air lap time, where the clean air lap time, as I said, was any lap set outside of 2.5 seconds of the car ahead across the whole Grand Prix. And it was the 2 Red Bulls who were comfortably the fastest cars in clean air, and then it was actually Sebastian Vettel in the Aston Martin, the only other driver to be within a second of the 2 Red Bulls in clean air, then Charles Leclerc, Pierre Gasly and Lewis Hamilton, 1.2 seconds off the pace in clean air. That just shows how much of an advantage he was putting to those 2 Red Bulls if he was able to stick to them for the entire Grand Prix. But equally, he did only have 15 laps in clean air as well, as he was stuck behind Sergio Perez for a majority of the Grand Prix. However, those laps have been excluded. And then unfortunately for Valtteri Bottas, we can see him below George Russell and also Fernando Alonso, 2.407 seconds off of the pace. But now taking that middle percentage column, which is the percentage to the pace leader, and then averaging this across all of the 6 Grand Prix that have happened so far, we end up with a leaderboard that looks a little bit like this. Max Verstappen is declared the fastest driver so far across this season, and Lewis Hamilton is just 0.13% down, and Sergio Perez is 0.17% down. Then there is an enormous percentage gap to Valtteri Bottas, who is still the 4th fastest driver so far across these 6 races, then Leclerc, Sainz, Gasly, Norris and Tsunoda. And then also looking at that table on the right, the team percentage pace difference. This just takes the fastest team's pace in each of the Grand Prix and then averages each of those out. And so far across the first 6, it is Red Bull who now has the faster car across this whole season. It was at Monaco Mercedes that had the fastest car. Red Bull have now since overtaken them. Then Ferrari is the 3rd fastest with McLaren in P4. Now I am also slowly working on a new sort of visual graphic to sort of show exactly where each of the drivers' clean air laps pop up. However, I'm still coding that and I'm still sort of working on exactly how to present it, so it'll probably possibly come for the French Grand Prix. But now to do the same sort of analysis, but look at each of the overall stints. We have a table that looks a little bit like this. I am aware that I'm missing the hard compounds. That's going to slide on in a little bit. But for the moment, on stint 1, it was only Lance Stroll that set lap times on the hards for stint number 1. But taking a look at the soft stints, it was Sebastian Vettel who was the fastest car in clean air. However, we can actually see that there were 5 drivers. They are in the bracketed asterisks that have not set any clean air lap times on the soft compound of tyres. So they did run the soft compound, however they were never in clean air to set a lap time. So unfortunately we will never know their true pace within this table, but it is Vettel that tops it from Gasly, then Hamilton. And then equally in the mediums it is Raikkonen who tops it from Latifi, and then Russell also had no clean air laps within his medium stint. But if we now just slide it over to look at Lance Stroll's hard compound tyre pace, a 146.733. That is absolutely ridiculous pace on the hard compound of tyre. That is that is actually over 2 seconds a lap faster than Kimi Raikkonen and Nicholas Latifi on the medium compound of tyre. But then from here, if we just take a look at stint number 2, every single driver went onto the hard compound of tyre for their stint number 2. And it was actually Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez who topped this leaderboard. Again, Sebastian Vettel finds himself P3, and then half a second down in clean air is Lewis Hamilton. Then comes Pierre Gasly, Leclerc, Tsunoda, Norris, Ricciardo, Bottas, etc, etc, etc. And this is where the stint breakdown actually stops, as it sort of gets a little bit finicky and picky, with some drivers doing 4 stints, only lasting about 5 or 6 laps, and then everyone pretty much doing a 3rd stint that only lasted 2 laps. So yeah, I can't really get a great deal of actual pace information from that final stint, as it was an absolute sprint and no one was in clean air whatsoever, so I've decided not even to bother looking at it. And so with the general race overview all done and dusted for the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, the overall pace percentage in clean air, and then also the stint breakdown, we are now going to take a look at the teammate comparisons for each of the 10 teams. We are going in 2020 championship order, and we start with Mercedes. I will also take a little bit of time to explain the 4 graphs that pop up on the screen in the Mercedes segment, and then I'll just jump straight on into the remaining teams for the rest of the video. So on screen now is the Mercedes panel, and in the top left we have the Mercedes lap time chart. Valtteri Bottas is in the turquoise colour and Lewis Hamilton is in the black. The grey dotted line is their previous lap time pace at this track. So in this case it was Valtteri Bottas's lap times, as he was the lead Mercedes car in 2019. Then taking a look at the graph down below, this is the Mercedes gaps. Again, Lewis Hamilton in the black, Valtteri Bottas in that small little squidge in the turquoise. This shows the gap on each of the individual laps, and it shows it across the entire Grand Prix. Then the graph in the top right just shows the Mercedes positional charts. And then finally, the graph in the bottom right is the percentage pace difference. So this takes all of Lewis Hamilton's lap times, it divides them all by Valtteri Bottas's lap times, then converts them all to percentages. Then any percentage that is above 100 is when Lewis Hamilton is going faster. And then any percentage that is below 100 is when Valtteri Bottas is going faster. We can then divide this percentage pace difference down the middle, and therefore we can say that for 19.6% of this Grand Prix where both cars were running together, Valtteri Bottas was the faster of the 2 Mercedes, and for 80.4% it was Lewis Hamilton. This is the most significant pace difference of Mercedes this season. Then looking at the rest of the graphs, we can just highlight their 2019 pace by this blue arrow here, which was actually a 1 minute 46.392. We will come back to this lap time in just a little moment's time. But just here by this green arrow, we can see Lewis Hamilton was so much faster in the first portion of the Grand Prix on that soft compound of tyre. He was almost 2 seconds a lap faster than Valtteri Bottas. Then post pit stops, just here in the middle section by the red arrow, he is once again a little bit faster, not quite as quick as stint number 1, and he extends the gap post pit stop from about 15 seconds all the way up to almost 30. We then have the safety car period, which bunches everybody up, and then post safety car period, once again Hamilton is about 1 second, just over a second a lap consistently faster than Valtteri Bottas, extending this gap from just under 5 seconds to almost 35. But now taking a look at the Mercedes stint pace and comparing the two drivers together across the whole Grand Prix, and there is their 2019 pace. Their 2019 pace was actually 0.3 a lap quicker than their 2021 pace. And across the whole Grand Prix, Bottas was 1.1 seconds slower per lap than Lewis Hamilton. And in stint number 1, when they were both on the soft compound of tyres, he was 2.5 seconds down. And this is both in clean air as well. He did, however, claw some of this pace back when he went onto the hard compound of tyres for stint number 2, but he was still just under a second a lap down on Lewis Hamilton. But from Mercedes, we will now take a look at Red Bull. And again, we start by splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle. And we can see that for 33.3%, exactly 1/3, it is Sergio Perez who is the faster of the two Red Bulls. And therefore, for 2/3 of the Grand Prix, it is Max Verstappen. Where Max Verstappen is in the lighter blue line and Sergio Perez is in the darker line. And we can see by this grey dotted line here that their average 2019 lap time pace in clean air was a 1:46.585. Again, we will come back to this number a little bit later on. But unlike the Mercedes pair in the first stint, they were essentially even. The gap stayed at just under 2 seconds for the entirety of the first stint. Max Verstappen then comes in for his pit stop first, which spikes the gap in Sergio Perez's favour to about 15 seconds. Perez lasts a little bit longer on his soft compound of tyres, then comes in for a slightly slow pit stop, and then after this pit stop, they are once again dead even. The gap now staying around 3 seconds, whilst again Perez is battling with Lewis Hamilton, which is just what this little dark green arrow highlights here, where there is a little bit of a battle going on with Hamilton. Then post-safety car, Max Verstappen is only just a couple of tenths a lap faster than Sergio Perez, which extends the gap from just below 2 seconds to about 4 until Max's retirement. Then breaking down the Red Bull pace, overall across the whole Grand Prix, there was a 1/10 deficit between the two drivers, and their 2019 pace was 1.1 seconds slower than their 2021 pace. So Mercedes were actually faster in 2019, whereas Red Bull was slower in 2019. Then looking at their stint 1 pace, neither driver had any competitive clean air laps within stint number 1, so there is no average lap time to take. However, stint number 2 on the hard compound of tyre there is, and it was again a 1.5 deficit to Sergio Perez from Max Verstappen. Then from the team of Red Bull, we take a look at the Papaya McLaren team. And again, splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 41.2%, it was Daniel Ricciardo who was the faster of the two McLarens. And for 58.2%, it was Lando Norris. A much more even spread compared to what we saw in Monte Carlo. Then looking at their 2019 lap time pace by this grey dotted line, that was a 1:47.907. But the first thing to notice is Lando Norris's early pit stop in order to undercut Valtteri Bottas, which spikes the lap time gap in favour of Daniel Ricciardo to about 18 seconds. Then a couple of laps after this, Ricciardo comes in here in the red arrow. However, he loses out to the undercut of Lando Norris, and the gap post-pit stop rises to about 6 seconds. Undercut was the wrong term, as Ricciardo was originally behind, but he did end up losing 5 seconds to Lando Norris, who pitted earlier. Then post pit stop they were fairly even, but Lando Norris was just a little bit faster overall, raising the gap post pit stop from 6 seconds all the way to almost 10. Then we have the safety car period where they bunch up once again, and post-safety car periods they are equally as even. Again, Lando Norris might just be a little bit quicker, but equally a little bit more inconsistent in lap time. Then taking a look at the McLaren lap times overall, it was just under a tenth between the two cars in clean air, with their 2019 lap pace being 8.5 tenths slower than 2021. With their Stint 1 pace on the soft compound of tyres being very significant, Ricciardo was 1.6 seconds faster than Lando Norris on the soft compound tyre. However, taking a look now at stint number 2, it is Lando Norris who gets this back, again by just under a tenth of a second. Then from McLaren, we take a look at Aston Martin, and these drivers are exceptionally even once again, but we only have half a race to compare the two. So splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, for 34.5%, just over a third, Lance Stroll was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for just over 2/3, it was Sebastian Vettel, with their 2019 pace highlighted by the grey dotted line being a 147.749. We then have the two drivers being exceptionally even by this light green arrow, with the gap hovering around 8 seconds in Sebastian Vettel's favour. But bear in mind, Vettel is on the soft compound of tyre and Lance Stroll is on the hard compound of tyre, and Pirelli predicted a 1.4 second pace gap between the two compounds. We then have the pit stop here for Sebastian Vettel, where Lance Stroll does actually get back past, and then they are exceptionally even. Sebastian can't take advantage of his new hard compound of tyres, and the gap stays at 8 seconds until Lance Stroll's retirement. And then very briefly looking at the Aston Martin lap time pace, because there isn't too much to compare between the two drivers, we can see that there is a half a second pace deficit between Stroll and Vettel, but remember Vettel went all the way to the end, so overall this can be a touch on the misleading side if Stroll didn't make it all the way to the end. However, stint number 1 on the hard compound of tyre, Stroll was 2.5 tenths faster than Sebastian Vettel on the soft compound of tyre, where again Pirelli predicts there to be a 1.4 second deficit between the C3 and the C5 compound. And then the stint 2 pace, unfortunately no data for Lance Stroll as he did have that tyre failure, but for Sebastian Vettel on the hard compound it was a 145.609. which is equally 1.1 seconds faster than Lance Stroll's average competitive lap time pace on stint number 1. However, again, stint 2, they've got slightly less fuel on board. And then from Aston Martin, we take a look at team number 5, and that is Alpine. And again, there isn't a great deal of data, and there is no point in doing the percentage pace difference, as Ocon only managed to do 3 laps, which were not at all competitive. So the only thing that we can really do with Alpine here is look at their 2019 lap pace, which was a 148.330. And then from there, we can take a look at what Alonso managed to do in his overall pace. Unfortunately, Ocon doesn't have an average competitive lap time, but Alonso was half a second faster than the 2019 pace of the Renault. Then from Alpine, we take a look at Ferrari. Now, at the request of some of the viewers, I've changed Carlos Sainz's colour to be black rather than a darker red, and Charles Leclerc has remained Ferrari red. But splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, for 45.1%, it was Carlos Sainz who was the faster car, and for 54.9%, it was Charles Leclerc, with their 2019 pace being a 1 minute 46.590. And equally, in their first stint just before the pit stops, they were actually very even, if a little bit inconsistent. They then both come in for their pit stops around the same sort of time, and then by this red arrow, again, Carlos Sainz is probably about a half a second-ish, maybe a second a lap sometimes, slower than Charles Leclerc, which raises the gap from 20 seconds to about 30 just at the safety car period. However, post-safety car, up until the second safety car and the red flag, they are very even. And then looking at the Ferrari's overall lap times compared to their 2019 pace, we can see that they were just a tenth slower in 2019 compared to 2020, with Carlos Sainz overall being 8 tenths a lap slower than Charles Leclerc. Then unfortunately there is no stint 1 data for Charles Leclerc as he never set a lap time within clean air. However, stint number 2, when they were both on the hard compounds, they did, and it was actually a 1.8 second deficit to Charles Leclerc from Carlos Sainz. So he did really kind of struggle on those hard compound of tyres in the latter stages of the race. Then from Ferrari, we take a look at Alfa Tauri, and once again splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle. For 43.1%, it was Yuki Tsunoda who was the faster driver, and for 56.9%, it was Pierre Gasly, with their 2019 lap time pace being a 1:47.083. Then, in a similar manner to Mercedes, we actually have a very big pace difference between the two cars, with Pierre Gasly in the black being about half a second to a second a lap quicker than Yuki Tsunoda, which raises the gap from just under 5 seconds to just under 10 at the first pit stop phase. We then have that first pit stop phase highlighted here in the red arrows, and then post pit stop they're actually very, very even by these two yellow arrows. If anything, Pierre Gasly is actually a little bit slower, and the gap decreases from just under 5 or just under 10 seconds to just over 5 at the point of the first safety car. However, after the first safety car restart, it is Pierre Gasly who again is about 3 or 4 tenths a lap faster than Yuki Tsunoda, raising the gap from just over 1 second to just under 5. And looking at the AlphaTauri's lap times overall compared to their 2019 pace, they were 6 tenths a lap faster in 2021, with Yuki Tsunoda being on average about 4 tenths a lap slower than Pierre Gasly across the whole Grand Prix. And again, unfortunately, in stint number 1, we don't have any information for Yuki Tsunoda as he never set a clean air lap time. However, stint number 2, on the hard compound, they did, and Yuki Tsunoda was just over 4 tenths a lap slower than Pierre Gasly. Then from AlphaTauri, we take a look at Alfa Romeo, and splitting the percentage pace difference down the middle, for 43.1% it was Giovinazzi who was the faster car, and for 56.9% it was Kimi Räikkönen, with their 2019 lap time pace being a 1:47.353. With an extremely early pit stop here from Giovinazzi, which pops the gap in Räikkönen's favour to just over 20 seconds. It is then Räikkönen's turn to come in for a pit stop just after this, which allows Giovinazzi to come back ahead, albeit 7 seconds in front. Then post Kimi Räikkönen pit stop, it is Räikkönen who is just a little bit, only just, by about 2 or 3 tenths a lap faster than Giovinazzi, who actually has a small little mistake around lap 24. Then just after the safety car restart, Räikkönen actually managed to get back past, and then they were exceptionally even, with the gap staying just over 1 second. And taking a look at the Alfa Romeo lap times and comparing it to their 2019 pace, they were actually half a second quicker in 2019. So much like Mercedes, who were 3 tenths quicker in 2019, Alfa Romeo were half a second quicker in 2019. With the two Alfa Romeo drivers again being exceptionally close over the whole Grand Prix. In Monaco, there was just 1,000th separating them, and now in Baku, there is 86 thousandths separating them. And across stint number 1, where Kimi Räikkönen started on the medium, Giovinazzi unfortunately doesn't have any clean air lap data, but for stint number 2 on the hards, they do, where there is a half a second deficit from Räikkönen down to Giovinazzi. Then penultimately, we will take a look at Haas, and again splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle. For 21.6%, it was Mazepin who was the faster car, and for 78.4%, it was Schumacher. Again, this is one of the more significant trends that we have seen in Haas, with Haas's 2019 lap time pace being a 1:48.410. With the first stint actually being very even between the two drivers, the gap stayed at around 1 second. The differences, however, came after the first pit stop phase, where actually Nikita Mazepin was in front for just a little bit after Mick Schumacher's pit stop. However, post these pit stops, it was Mick Schumacher who was consistently around half a second faster than Nikita Mazepin, sometimes a second faster, until his mistake on lap 25, which rose the gap from 10 seconds post pit stop all the way to 45 at the safety car line. Then post-safety car, it was interestingly Mazepin who was just a touch faster up until the second safety car and red flag period, and equally he was the slightly more consistent driver of the two Haas cars. But looking at the Haas's lap times overall and comparing it to their 2019 pace, they were again 2 tenths quicker in 2019 compared to 2021, with there being a second difference between the two drivers over the whole Grand Prix. And stint 1, with both drivers starting on the softs, there was an 8/10th difference between the two, with Mazepin being the slower, and then on the hard compound of tyre, this gap increased, and he was 1.1 seconds a lap slower than Nikita Mazepin. And then finally, for the race edition of the Race Weekend Data Analysis, we'll take a look at Williams, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle. For 41.7%, it was Nicholas Latifi, who was the faster of the two, and for 58.3%, it was George Russell in white, with their 2019 pace being a very slow 1 minute 48.419. With, interestingly, George Russell actually starting all the way at the back with a very early pit stop, which spiked the gap to about 18 seconds. Where until Nicholas Latifi's pit stop, it was Latifi who was ahead. However, post this pit stop, Latifi was about half a tenth, maybe 4/10 a lap faster for about half this stint, which he closed the gap down from 8 seconds to just under 2. However, after lap 20, it was George Russell who was the faster car, until the safety car, the first safety car. Where then after the first safety car, it was 100% George Russell who was the faster car by about 3 or 4/10 a lap, consistently over Nicholas Latifi, rising this gap from just over 1 second to about 10 at the checkered flag, or the point, where George Russell had to retire. But looking at the Williams lap times overall and comparing it to their 2019 pace, they were exactly 7/10 a lap slower in 2019 compared to 2021, with Nicholas Latifi being almost 4/10 a lap slower than George Russell over the entire Grand Prix. And then stint number 1, when Latifi started on the medium, as did George Russell, but George Russell only did 2 or 3 laps on his first set, so there was no competitive clean air lap time to take, until we got to stint number 2, on the hards, where actually Nicholas Latifi was just a little bit faster, 3.5 per lap. And there we go, there is the end of the race edition of the Race Weekend Data Analysis for the Baku Grand Prix, or the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, whichever name you choose to call it. Please let me know in the comments below what you thought of today's episode, and also what surprised you the most about the data presented in today's video. But that's all I've got for you today, guys. I hope you have enjoyed, and I will catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.